Well, good afternoon, good evening, my friends. I'm Erica Lukes, and yes, I'm trying something different with my backdrop. So prepare to be a little frightened, but I wanted to, with all of my wonderful travels all over the world, I wanted to give you a backdrop of what I experienced, what I saw. This is a photograph that I took when I was in Hessdalen, Norway, with Erling Strand and Project Hessdalen. And so this is the beautiful sky. I was so lucky to see the Northern Lights. It was absolutely stellar. And so I thought we would just give that a try. And I want to thank all of you for being here. Jim, Scott, Northern UFO, Signal Observer, Simon Fly, Collie, Peter, Spooky, J Bench, Amy. Thank you guys for getting in here and supporting the show, being here every week, and creating a really fun and intelligent chat. I appreciate you guys are amazing. So thank you for everything you do. I want to also thank my Patreons who help keep the show on the air. That means a lot to me. And I want to give a shout out to Mario, who has been there right with me since almost the beginning. And I appreciate him. And then also I want to thank Peter for helping me on social media, get word out about the shows. It's cool. This is like a team effort. And so I really, really appreciate you. And I also want to give a little brief mention to Expanding Frontiers Research, which is a new organization that I started with Jack Brewer and Barry Greenwood. And we are dedicated to moving things forward. We are dedicated to, on my end, preserving historical information. I have right now, in a commercial space where things are stored, a great archive, a one of a kind. And I am dedicated to making sure that this information is preserved and available for researchers who want to look at specific things. So as I go through and catalog everything, that will be available at expandingfrontiersresearch.org. You can also get on there to see Jack is going to start loading some really cool things up with all the FOIA requests that he's done over the years. And just recently, well, today, in fact, he came out with a new article, and it is called Anti-Semitic Email Sent to Utah Governor Had David Icke Link and got pushed back from the list. And so here in Utah, this was a big news story back in the day, and it's been a few months ago, almost a year ago, when a fellow that was head of a company here in Utah sent out an anti-Semitic email talking about Jews, talking about the vaccine, talking about all of these wild, unfounded conspiracy theories. And one of the recipients on that list was now Governor Spencer Cox. And so we did a FOIA, Jack did a FOIA, and uncovered a series of emails to high-powered people in the tech industry and business industry in Utah. And it was actually quite refreshing to see some of their responses because they weren't going to have it. And I had a conversation with Jack last night. So what do we think this group of people who are clearly not going to promote unfounded conspiracy theories might have to say about unfounded claims, many of them taking place up at Skinwalker Ranch? I don't know, but we'll have to reach out, find out. And on that note, next Friday, Jack Brewer will be here to discuss some other interesting things that we have both been uncovering, and we cannot wait to do that. So without further ado, my guest this evening, I'm really excited to talk with, because she's so knowledgeable on many, many subjects, and I really appreciate that. So Leah Prime is here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Erica. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And I want to just read for people that aren't familiar with you. Although if you're on Twitter these days, you have to be pretty familiar with you because you're doing great things there. But you are an ex-academic-turned-technologist. You received a bachelor's degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and attended graduate school at Indiana University School of Informatics. If I'm saying any of this wrong, just shoot me. And computing.
Okay, so far, so good.
You, baby Joe. Your interest in ufology is primary through the lens of Jungian myth, emergent phenomenology, including spiritual awakenings, mystical experiences, and psychedelia and consciousness. You have spoken on ethical technology and human design at a number of conferences and academic institutions, and you're interested in how technology is deployed to shape and undermine consensus reality. And so, I mean, that just, okay, mind blown. How cool
I
are
mean,
you?
it's ufology in a nutshell without actually talking about flying saucers and aliens, right?
Right. Well, and I mean, this must be because you were on a show with Steve Cambrian last week, Truth Seekers, and I loved the interview because you were talking about Art Bell and
Mhm.
the legacy, the influence that Art Bell had on a whole generation of people. And I loved the way both of you were talking about some of the guests that Art Bell brought on and some of the ways that Art Bell would go, oh, nope, I'm out of here. Not you're talking
Yes.
about, racism and I'm married to somebody from the Philippines, you're done. It was a great conversation between the two of you. And I really, really appreciated that. So definitely go check that show out. And you can find Leah at Leah Prime on Twitter. And she's got a link to that show. It's definitely very good. And so you liked listening to stuff at a young age. Like how old were you?
Oh,
Like 9?
so yeah, so I always talk about this. So I was raised almost like Orthodox Jewish, very, very observant family. And so as a result, like didn't watch TV or anything on Friday nights through Saturday. It was Shabbat. So I very much grew up a huge fan of radio. Obviously not kosher for Shabbat, but that's okay. I could hide it in my room. And very much a night owl. And always loved weird stuff, right? Like always just was fascinated by anything kind of at the edges of reality or uh, realism. And I grew up with two loves. One was amateur radio. Like I've been licensed for almost my entire life. I have a vanity call sign. I have a tattoo of a radio on my forearm. I think I'm like the only non-boomer woman into amateur radio at this point in the United States. And I grew up listening to Art Bell, and he was an amateur radio operator, and he was talking about all the weird stuff that I was interested in. And I can distinctly remember setting my bedside alarm clock, like when I was in fifth or sixth grade, to stay up and listen to a show and then go back to sleep in the morning. Like that pretty much summed up my I guess young adulthood and adolescence.
That is so cool. I mean, and I remember, I remember listening to Coast, and
Mhm.
I know you're not a TV person, but, for me, I watched, the X-Files and some of these things and read Communion. And I mean, it was always been a part of me that I was intrigued.
Mhm.
I'm intrigued with life. I'm intrigued with death. I'm intrigued with the unknown. And it's just been so amazing. It is amazing to think about the limitless possibilities out there. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also during a time when, I mean, this really predates the internet. So Coast to Coast AM was really the only place for me to have exposure to these things until, I was in my teens and in college where I had access to the internet then and like more subcultures in general. But it used to be that like Art Bell was where you heard about this stuff. You didn't hear about it, it wasn't on the news, it wasn't in the newspaper. You heard about it on Art Bell.
yeah, and that's interesting. He was such an interesting figure, and or not a tragic death, and things, and a lot of mysteries around him with that I think are fascinating. And I know that Amy Collins is in chat, and she knows a lot about Art Bell and has great stories to tell as well. And so it is interesting how some of these people influenced me, you, all of us that are probably listening to the show. And I just want to say, Steve Long just said you're awesome. Love that
Thank
she
you,
remains
Steve.
objective and stresses the burden of proof and evidence standards. And that is really, yeah, helpful. You've got a great group of people that you have a community on Twitter, and you're doing your Invisible Night School and
Mhm.
just adding some great conversations to the subject, some grounded and needed conversations to the subject. And I have to just give you kudos for doing that. We need it. You're a breath of fresh air.
Well, thank you, Erica. Yeah, my look, I've only been sort of investing myself in ufology for just a couple months at this point. I think probably starting in about June this year. And I was simultaneously enchanted by the conversations I was hearing and also felt very strongly that there was a lack of integrity and elevation to a lot of these conversations, that there was not a standard of integrity that I would expect for the subject. And I think when you're in those situations, I felt a personal sense of responsibility and basically made it incumbent on myself to make a space in the community to have, I would say, higher order conversations with people that were interested in the subject, but were not devotional to a particular outcome or cause or phenomena. They were just more interested in the research and the critical analysis. So I've been very lucky to find that community so far and to be welcomed into it.
Yeah, that is incredibly lucky. Sometimes people get into this and they don't know who to surround themselves with, and as a result, they can go down some pretty dangerous and dark rabbit holes.
Hmm.
So I think that's really great that you've had that. You found those wonderful people. A lot of them are here in chat tonight. I appreciate that, and that's we need to have voices like yours and like Steve's and Simon and people like that that are out there talking and asking questions that need to be asked, because as you've observed, as all of us have observed, there's been so much garbage that has been put out since the inception of the subject, since 1947. It's just been,
Hmm.
even though it was a little bit better back then, maybe, but now it's just an absolute, um, I don't know, cesspool, I guess,
Yeah,
of things.
yeah, what it keeps reminding me of is that like we teach like just in our education system, right? Like we teach science to people who don't know what science is. Like as they progress through from like elementary school to middle school and high school. But the reality is too, like after those, like the learning of science, it takes a lot of science knowledge to also just like discern what science actually is. And I feel like we have this culture or this moment that is just very poor at sort of discerning what actual scientific interrogation looks like. And they're very easily kind of confused by the presence of like instruments or measurement. And they think just the presence of data in and of itself confers legitimacy to research or to phenomena. And it's simply not the case. This is something obviously I talk about this all the time. Um, and
Well,
I
keep
certainly
on
think about it a
talking.
lot. Yeah.
Because I love that. I
Um,
mean, I think that a lot of people, I mean, we get into this and we don't have the kind of background that people like you do. And that is why I think so many of us can get taken for a ride, because
mhm.
we, assume there's a figure that we see on TV or has, all these subs on YouTube or Twitter, and that we must, that must make them credible. And that is, it's just so far from the truth, but it's a great opening point for grifters and people that have nefarious intentions to get out there and then really manipulate people.
Oh yeah. I mean, it feels like there's almost emergent subcommunities within ufology, and huge portions of that, of course, are people that are just interested in this either for validation or entertainment, right? Like they don't want this sort of ontology around the subject disrupted through any kind of discourse, whether scientific or philosophical or whatever. Like they want basically the version of like sitting around a campfire swapping stories without pushback. And I get it, right? Like that's entertainment. But like when we're talking about like actual interrogation into the subject, yeah, like there have to be standards of evidence, have to be like integrity to information and to research. And like that's part of the reason why I've been so into like what you're doing and like what Jack does, because I feel like it's so important to bring these standards of integrity to the subject, especially if you treat the subject with the enormity or the intellectual seriousness that you'd think it would deserve.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That
Yeah.
means a lot. And I know that Jack would say the same thing too. And it's been and I've been doing this publicly for almost 10 years. And I will tell you, as you've heard me talk about on my show, it's not been a pleasant experience. I have a lot of, well, not a lot. I've got a few friends now because I've weeded a lot of them out, but I've got some really wonderful people in my life that will be in my life forever. And I
Mhm.
appreciate their kindness and support and knowledge in kind of getting me through some of the humps that I've experienced. And it's been, for me, I don't want other people to have to go through that. And I'm sure that you feel the same, and everyone listening. It's like there's no need to have to be in a community to put yourself out there because you have
Mhm.
questions about things, and then to be targeted and bullied and harassed and I mean threatened. It's not okay. And to see some of the things that have been happening to people that we know, on Twitter and
Mhm.
on other various social media platforms is pretty disturbing. And that the more that we can create a large cohesive group of people that want standards, that want integrity, and that won't tolerate this kind of stuff, I think the better this will be for all of us.
Yeah, oh, I totally agree. And like that's one of the things that optimistically stands out to me is the opportunity to basically coalition build. in this space, to find opportunities to cross-support one another's initiatives and projects, to be available for conversation. And I think also to do, I would say, part of being a good steward to this subculture means having difficult conversations with other people and other culture carriers in this space. And those are hard conversations to have. Very candidly, they're hard to have when you're already like a woman in this space, right? There's not very many of us. And I think it's, I mean, candidly, I think the misogyny in this space is real. And it can frequently feel, like a boys' club. In many respects, but I do feel like like I said, to be a good steward of this community necessitates having difficult conversations. It necessitates being able to, quote unquote, cross the aisle and coalition build with people on their projects. And I think also continuing to basically continue this drumbeat of like, you know, integrity, accountability, willingness to change ideas and opinions based on provision of evidence and data, and being able to do that publicly, right? Like being able and willing to do that publicly feels like an essential part of being someone with integrity in this space. And I feel like there's honestly a dearth of that. There's not a lot of that, unfortunately. I mean, there's not a lot in the world in general, and there's definitely not a lot of it in ufology.
No, there isn't a lot in ufology. And then when you have specific TV shows that are promoting pseudoscience and not being forthright with information that they promised, that doesn't help anything. And so, I mean, what are your thoughts about, and I'll just get this out of the way because I've got, me and my love of talking about Skinwalker, but when you look at something, as getting into this again, kind of with a fresh lens, like what do you see when you look at something like Skinwalker Ranch?
I mean, oh boy. So I think that it is incumbent to have standards. Like I'm going to say the word integrity probably 1,000 times tonight, but I think it's very important to have standards of integrity when you're talking about the numinous or the mysterious, basically to avoid grift, to avoid money grabs. And my perception of Skinwalker, quite frankly, is that it is a very successful entertainment franchise that is very good at capturing its audience's attention. It's very good at shrouding what it finds, quote unquote, with pseudoscience and scientific language in a way that probably makes it seem very legitimate and plausible to many of its viewers. But it is very difficult for me to see it as anything other than a carrot on a stick getting people to continue buying into a franchise by a very successful business person. That's like, I don't think there's anything interesting about it other than as a psychosocial phenomenon. It's very interesting watching people become enraptured with like something that very clearly entertains them, almost to a religious fervor, quite frankly. I mean, you could say that about the subject. You can definitely say this about this TV show. And I think one of the troublesome things in this space is that I think there's potential value in having big money in this space in the sense of investing in it. But I think that having that, requires a degree of accountability and integrity that we simply haven't seen from the money in this space. And I don't just mean with Skinwalker. I mean with like across the board, the wealthy people in this space have, in my opinion, failed to present the evidence or information or even good faith required in order to sufficiently satisfy even basic skepticism. And I say this as someone, by the way, like I am very much on the woo side of skepticism. Like anyone who's talked to me knows that. Like I don't think I have this crazy debunk attitude. I just have, I would say, high standards of accountability for the subject.
Thank you. And that's what we should all have.
Right.
That's what is just, I mean, but so I don't know. It's like I don't know, because well, I mean, like I said, since the inception of the subject, I mean, there have not been, I mean, I believe there were maybe back in the 50s and 60s, there was a little bit more going on and it was a little bit more credible, but then you get, the usual suspects that emerge in the 70s and they're creating stories about, remote viewing and getting government funding, and then Serpo and some of these stories that just, again, MJ12, and
Yes.
it's like again and again, it's like, Okay, wow. So another
Yeah.
new generation comes in, and guess what? We're going to talk about just the alien autopsy again and
Yes.
all of this stuff. And it's just like, I mean, granted, I learned the hard way. I went through all of these things, but I very quickly
Right.
saw through some of this stuff and these people that are just, I mean, they're making money off of a grift.
Right. Yeah. I mean, UFO stands for what? Unlimited financial opportunity.
Oh, I love that.
Um, and like, I think I always call it like UFO samsara. Like, I was never a true believer. I just like totally like circumvented that somehow. Um, but I feel like so many people I talk to who sit on this side of basically demanding accountability and integrity, like they were at one point true believers. And had sort of the ontological shock of like realizing that a lot of their beliefs weren't accurate or were false or were predicated on bad faith or bad actors. And I think the other thing too that's important to mention is that the more we allow grift into the community and the more we allow these sort of P.T. Barnum-esque showmanship, it crowds out the really interesting stuff and the really
Right.
compelling stuff. And I feel like it suffers in turn, like we're not able to concentrate on the really compelling and interesting stuff because people just continually are caught up in like the entertainment side of things without any sort of critical thought.
Absolutely. I mean, that is one of the best things I've heard in a long time. And you are spot on. And that's sad. I know that I have, Barry Greenwood is a very dear friend of mine. And we have conversations almost every day about things and how, he's gone through points in his life where he's just seen that. And he went through all of that with MJ12 for 10 years. And it was just like, okay, I'm stepping back, I'm doing my thing, I'm doing my archiving, and you guys can have what you're doing on a public front. But for me, being in the public like you are, I think we have an opportunity, not only an opportunity, but an obligation to make
Right.
sure that we're putting forward credible information and to make sure that we aren't I mean, doing the Linda Moulton Howe thing, doing,
Right.
whatever some of these people have done for years that is just either, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's I've joked with Spooky a lot that it's like UFO samsara, right? You're just like trapped in this endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth, and it's always the same story in ufology. And when we were Erica, when we were talking in the green room before the show, I was saying, look, I don't really know very much about ufology. I've only been down this rabbit hole the last couple months, but I know a lot about Art Bell. And one of the things that astounded me when I came back to this, having grown up on Art Bell, all these characters are still around. Stephen Greer, still around. Like, I know him from like 1998, 2000, and here we are 22 years later, and he's still spinning the same yarns. Jonathan Reed, still around. Like, all these people that I knew, like, through the lens of Coast to Coast AM when I was like 13, like, here I am in my late 30s, and I'm still going, oh my God, these people are still here telling the exact same story. Nobody's calling them out on it. There's no culpability whatsoever. And it feels like no meaningful progress has been made. Now, I do think meaningful progress is made in like peripheral parts of the constellation of subjects, like things like spiritual emergence or psychedelics or consciousness or NDEs or whatever. But like when we're talking about brass tacks like UFOs, it feels to me like it's constantly just treading water. And I think it's as much the fault of the communities as it is of the people who shape the community, because the community keeps buying into these stories.
Right. And I have to say, and I want to get your opinion on this. I've mentioned before on my show that I think we should quit using the hashtag UFO Twitter, to be honest, and find a new one. Because
Yeah.
the people that are dominating in that space are people, in my opinion, that aren't promoting the best information. And it seems to be this kind of echo chamber and this bullying and this to me, when I look at some of the central figures in that space, I'm seeing some things that are very troubling to me, having been somebody that was married to a white supremacist and an oath keeper, and who had very symbolic tattoos all over his body, identifying, flying his anti-Semitism, all of this stuff, and I'm seeing all of these things, and it's like nobody's getting it, and
Oh,
I
I mean,
really want.
right. How in 2022 do we still have major culture carriers in this community championing David Icke, right?
Right.
Like, and like, I'm a Jew. I like anti-Semitism is not a strange foreign thing to me. And like you kind of scratch the surface of any conspiracy and you get anti-Semitism. But the idea that like one of the things to me that was most telling about the Marina Sarin stuff wasn't wasn't that there was the presence of anti-Semitism, it was the fact that so many people failed to push back on it. Like that was very evident to me. How many people in the community failed to call this out? I don't care if Chris Mellon took his picture with her. He's not going to do a full background check on everyone he takes pictures with. Like that part is immaterial. But what matters to me is that these figures show up in the community and there's no sort of collective repulsion and like alienation of them from the community. Like I can't believe in 2022 I'm listening to people basically defend David Icke. Like this guy's a bad actor. He's anti-Semitic. Like why are we still having this conversation? We need to collectively do better than that.
Right, absolutely. And isn't it frightening? I mean, it almost seems like there's an uptick in this, and people have finally, these people who've been hiding in dark corners are finally finding a footing. And now it's just like, oh, you've got, that whatever, yeah, Marina coming out, and I mean, just some of these people, and literally, I mean, I'm looking at specific people and looking at their tattoos and going, you can go to the Anti-Defamation League. You can
Yeah,
check
like
out
pay
hate
attention to this.
symbols. You can do that. You should do that. And you should look at some of the imagery that people are putting on their shows, or, some of the keywords that people are saying over and over again.
Yeah, dog
They're
whistle language.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. They're speaking in code and symbols that other white supremacists, other anti-Semites pick up, other conspiracists, for sure.
Right. And I find it, I'm so glad that you are keyed into that. I think we all need to be keyed into that, because it's really not helpful for the subject. It's very hurtful I mean, it's shameful, actually, is what it is. And it is sad that nobody really spoke out about, well, Steve and you and other people, about Marina. But did Chris Mellon ever make a public statement about
I,
his photo with her?
I don't think so. I mean, very candidly, that's like I'm gonna tip my hand here. That's a side of ufology that I barely pay attention to. But she came onto my radar just by virtue of the sort of Nazi sympathies that she was espousing and the sort of brazenness of it, right? Like it wasn't even subtle with her; it was out and very, very evident and apparent.
Yeah, that was very interesting, and I really appreciate that. And so, Roberta wants to know how David Icke is bad again, and I would just say, well, he's anti-Semitic. He's promoting conspiracy theories that are not based in fact. He's yeah.
I am. I think the other thing that I think is worth noting here too is the UFO community has enormous overlap with the kind of new age spirituality. And like I look, and this is not me pointing fingers, like I have an altar full of crystals in my bedroom. Like this is no judgment, whatever. But I think the other thing is that this pernicious notion of like good vibes only becomes a lubricant for bad actors. Because
Right.
what it does is it puts people in the position of saying, well, like, oh, I just deal with good vibes. I don't, do any of that low vibration stuff. I don't call people out. I don't do that. I don't police people's behavior. And like, you don't have to police people's behavior. You just have to make it very clear that these behaviors are unacceptable in a community that is, at least in theory, trying to angle towards different ideas of truth and human experience. Like saying you're good vibes only is just a free pass. Or people who say, oh, I hate the drama, I don't get involved in the drama. Like at a certain point, it's actually really important to take sides, because this sort of veil of neutrality ultimately just makes you complicit in like harmful systems and institutions. And like that doesn't apply just to ufology. That's something that extends well outside that, but we see it in ufology all the time.
We do. And that, I mean, there's so many, for me, having gone through the situation I did with domestic violence, I mean, just to
Mm-hmm.
see the way that people, they don't, it's like they just turn around and walk the other way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, you know what? There are people dying, getting murdered every day. There are people that need help. What is our obligation to stand up and do the right thing in our communities, in the UFO space, at work? I mean, in
Mm-hmm.
all, it's like we have to be better than that. And it's really, and I do hear from some of my friends, okay, well, I just can't handle this drama in my life. I can't, blah blah blah. I want to be in this other space, and I get it. That would be really great. But guess what? The world is in a place where we need to take some responsibility, and it's not going to be. We're not going to change our communities by sitting back, on our ass on YouTube and or Twitter. We're going to do
Right.
that because we're getting involved in the grassroots level, the way we will here. And like you say so eloquently, we're holding people accountable for statements that are being made that can't be backed up and that are potentially harmful to people in this community.
Mhm. Look, one of the greatest acts of compassion and love that we can give to other people is to respect their agency and independence as individuals. And part of respecting that agency of individuals entails holding them accountable to what they say and what they do. That it is fundamentally an act of love to do this because it is an act of compassion. And it's not about one upmanship or punishment or retribution. It's about understanding and recognizing that as human beings, none of us are free from the obligation to show up in ways that help one another and that are, exemplify like the best kind of traits we possess. And that's like what I keep coming back to on this subject, that it's ultimately an act of respect to hold people accountable because I understand that other people possess their own individual agency.
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah, I just think it's important. And Phil, I love that you're in chat. And Phil's a very, wants case investigations and things like that. And I would say, Phil, if you, I mean, and yeah, I mean, I will have the crew from API on to talk about UFO investigations. But for me, because of the archive that I have and because of what I'm trying to do to make a bigger change in the subject, to make it more credible, to make it
Mhm.
more accessible and safe for people, then I am choosing to, definitely bring on people that are supportive of that and have information about things that can I believe really help us. I think your information, and I want to talk a little bit about data and some of the things that you wanted
Sure.
to talk about, but I just think these are important dialogues to have. We have to create integrity in the subject, and no greater place is there any lack of integrity other than MUFON, Phil, as you know. That was a cesspool, and Phil, you and I did many shows on MUFON that had nothing to do with UFOs. So I know you could fill me on that. We were both trying to make a difference, and we need to continue to do that. And so thanks, Morph, and everybody for being here. I appreciate you very much. But I mean, so we are trying to make a change. We are making a change. People are noticing this. You've got a big following. You're getting a bigger following by the day where you are involved in engaging people on Twitter, which I've got to, again, just good for you. Every time I go on Twitter, I'm just like, ugh. I just, I try to stay back a little bit because I'm not as adept at dealing with, or I'm just not in the space to deal with, some of the things that you deal with, even though I should know UFO Joe and that clown show is just, you know,
Yeah,
gotta
I mean,
the other
I,
way.
I've I will say very candidly, I've been pretty lucky so far. The internet can be extremely cruel, but I've largely found people to be very overwhelmingly welcoming and positive.
Good.
Um, but I also wanted to say too, just about what it means to be like, or attempt to be a standard bearer in this space, which is, I think it's important to understand that in speaking out against these things or about these things, it's unlikely to change anybody's minds, right? Um, but what it does do is it sends a very strong message of safety and acceptance to people that may not feel confident or comfortable or safe telling their story or being present in the community. And if I can present that to people, if I can make very clear that I am a beacon of someone who tries to have a standard of ethics and integrity and expects that of others, and has a candidly a very progressive worldview on the human experience and the vicissitudes of it, then I think that it will be successful. Like, I don't expect to change people's minds, but I do think it's important to create and champion spaces that are safe for all people to participate in, not just people that are going to toe the party line about different subjects or different ideas or individuals.
Thank you. And that is the way that we should all be, and that you're an example, and I think it is a really important thing, and that we should all be doing this and promoting that safety and integrity. in this
Yeah.
subject, and that's what we've been lacking for a long, long time. And I do you think, I mean, when I look back on, as I'm going through the archive and looking at different correspondence that I have, or looking at different publications, and I'm seeing some things like back in the 70s, there was a moment in time when there was a group of Nazis that were sending out propaganda to some of the researchers, the best researchers in the subject, and they were getting very intimidating things. I know Jenny Randalls over in the UK had an experience with them, but there were very few people. I think the attitude was of most researchers that it was just like, well, we're just going to focus on the UFO case. We're not going to pay any attention to this other stuff going on because it's not important. And when I'm looking at all of this and I'm seeing how now emboldened and embedded people are, I am saying, why didn't you guys take a stand on this back then? At what
Hmm.
point in time do we say this isn't going to work for us? And obviously nobody did it back then. So I think it's time that we do that now and really step it up. We have to, because this subject is turning, well,
It's
we're turning it
yeah.
into something good, but
It's yeah, and it's funny, like, to bring this back to the king, Art Bell, like, he has a very complicated legacy, right? Like, I think back on his show as being this, like, really formative experience. It brought me into radio, it brought me into high strangeness. It really shaped the media and culture that we see, not just in ufology, but in general right now. But he also was sort of the person on a broad scale to lay the framework to start unwinding consensus reality, right? And like the kind of totalitarian alt-right fascist movements that we see around the world, a lot of these are predicated on basically undermining consensus reality and crafting narratives for the post-truth era. And like that's what I see when I see ufology discussed on Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson does not care about UFOs. Tucker Carlson cares about being able to spin a narrative about how the government doesn't work. UFOs are proof of that. You shouldn't trust anything. The only true facts are found on Fox News. And that in and of itself basically pulls apart like the fabric of reality that we've lived in modern society. And like it's so disappointing to see this community and this subject co-opted into these talking points, partly because these movements don't, like, again, do not care about UFOs. They care about undermining the sense of community that we have largely like cultivated in the United States, for instance. It's been co-opted with the objective of undermining consensus reality, and like I said, crafting these narratives that basically sow dissent and create violence, both physical violence, spiritual violence, cultural violence. And, these narratives are not done by good actors. They're done by people that deliberately seek to profit materially and financially from these narratives. It's not done because they care about the subject or about the community.
right.
And it's so disappointing to see happen.
And so, when for me, I mean, I'm looking at people like Eric Weinstein and Peter Thiel and some of these people that are getting involved in this subject, and it's I mean, obviously they don't care about UFOs. There's a
No.
whole new agenda there, or a whole old new agenda, and so I think people need to be very cautious in jumping on that bandwagon. What are your
Mm-hmm.
feelings about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things I keep going back to, and again, this is the area of ufology that I probably touch and think about the least, partly because I find it kind of repellent, um, and also filled with like bad faith actors, quite frankly. But I feel like a lot of it too is really just a Trojan horse to build and support surveillance and warfare systems or national security systems. Like that's what I think of when I read a lot of the work from a lot of these former government actors. Like I don't think that they really particularly care about UFOs. I think they care about military contracts, and I think they care about building surveillance systems. And these are technologies that like people in the teal universe invest very heavily in. So I just think of it as ultimately like a business play that is conveniently couched in a subculture that is ardently supportive of those ventures.
Thank you.
Mhm.
That summed that up quite brilliantly, and so I appreciate that. And we'll actually go. I want to talk a little bit about data for a
Sure.
minute, because I think this is, to me, this is such a fascinating subject. And there has been an effort, over, I mean, for many decades to sweep up data, UFO data, to hide it in
Right.
a little hole, to hide it behind a paywall, to put it where, people won't have access to do research. And what possible means, I mean, why would you think people would be so interested in UFO data? Because to me, I don't think it's necessarily to look for UFOs. I think there's a whole other set of issues there as to why that data would want to be need to be collected, and it would be so sought after.
Well, I mean, again, I think a lot of it is surveillance, right? Like this was surveillance data. It's longitudinal data, so it's aggregated over time. Um, I think one of the things I think about frequently with this subject is that data is so heavily siloed across the public and private and government sectors that it's almost impossible to get a sense of what anything even is or what's going on, because there's been no meaningful aggregation or reconciliation attempts to standardize these resources, and then the actors in this space that have the means buy it up and make it inaccessible. As for justifications, again, I think it's purely business. I think it's purely business. It's ego driven, right? It's probably a three-way split between business, like financial interests, ego, and then candidly, like I think like government intervention. Like I don't think you have to be a conspiracy theorist to believe that the government is invested in this subject, either from a cultural control perspective or from a national security and like warfare perspective. And I think those three forces compete in this space to basically make data as inaccessible as possible. Um, and I also think there's it's highly lucrative to keep this as mysterious and fractured as it is, because it means that every individual or actor or body can sort of spin their own narrative around
Right,
this. We
right.
see this consistently, and that's a very lucrative thing. If you have enough data to create a comprehensive theory or insight, then you ultimately crater all these sort of like entertainment ventures that exist around this subject as well. And I mean, that would be incompatible with a lot of the major, I would say, market forces in ufology. Like this is a cash cow, not necessarily the community itself, but the ancillary military technology, surveillance, entertainment franchises, all that makes lots of money.
Yeah, it really does. It's so fascinating, and I just want to thank Scott for the nice donation. But when I have a lot of discussions with people about data, so you've got like a case coming into MUFON,
Mm-hmm.
and you get the person at the top, who they're like, maybe a handful of people that are looking at the cases coming in and deciding if they're going to take the good cases and then siphon them off to the black hole, and then the other cases go to the state directors, and then eventually the field investigators. And so you've got field investigators investigating things that aren't qualified, I mean, really are, I mean, it's questionable about
Mm-hmm.
skill and knowledge of people, which is, I understand that when you don't have a background in science and things like that, you're learning everything, and you're paying for a manual and things like that. But you know would data like that be useful for somebody that was looking at other things besides UFO sightings?
Like, would the data gathered be useful beyond? Oh yeah, of course, of
Okay.
course. I mean, I even think of this. Oh gosh. Um, who was it that was making, or like had the ambition of making, the computer vision app where you could take a picture and it would identify something in the sky? Like that is pure surveillance. Like that is a surveillance machine. And that's I mean, first of all, like computer vision can't do that. Not without like seriously good training data. But it's surveillance. It's if you have to pay for the app, again, it's a money grab. And the opportunity to spin a narrative. And I think, I wanted to address something else you said too about just like MUFON people or whoever running out to take sighting reports and stuff, which is like we kind of run into this chicken and egg problem where like we have this highly stigmatized taboo subject, although it's getting better. Like I'm pretty out and I'm like a legit professional and all that. So instead, your field researchers, they frequently have a personally vested interest in the subject, which gives them cognitive bias. They're frequently not like highly trained in the scientific method or data gathering or hypothesis testing or anything else. So that also confers like an inaccuracy or a degree of bias in their research. And the stigma of the subject, which is perpetuated by these actors, also keeps people with, I would say, valid and legitimate backgrounds and in skeptical backgrounds too from entering into the subject, right? Like we have plenty of people with lots of nice degrees, but if they're buying into the law of attraction wholesale, I'm not totally sure that they're going to be the best interrogators of this subject from a data collection or analysis perspective.
Well, and yeah, that's definitely true, and that's clearly why MUFON has never really come out with anything important and in 50 years. But I mean, to somebody else who is I've got some in the archive, which I hope all of you can come visit someday. I'm looking at what Bigelow did, with the Roper study. I'm looking at another study that he did, actually, that he commissioned, that John Alexander's wife, Victoria, did on how people in religious capacity would view UFOs, and
Mm-hmm.
so did this survey and things, and it was almost, I mean, to me, in my mind, they're figuring out, like Cambridge Analytica, what makes people tick, like what,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's that mining of personalities, how to manipulate them, and I see that is really, in my opinion, going on full force in the UFO space on social media with people that have bought, databases and things. I think that's exactly what Bigelow
Mm-hmm.
has done. I don't think he's ever investigated UFOs, but that's my own opinion. So people make the mistake of just saying there's nothing, this is garbage data, nobody would want it. And that to me is simply not the case.
Yeah, it's not the case, and also like I'm a big believer that sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? If you want to legitimize and give this subject and its associated gleanings, its data, or its whether qualitative or quantitative, the best way you legitimize it is by making it openly accessible to anyone. I mean, it doesn't take anything to make this data public, and I mean, shit, stick it on Kaggle.com, and like all the data scientists around the world would love to have a swing at it. This is totally the interest that dare not speak its name, because whenever I like shamefacedly admit that I'm into UFOs, no matter who I'm talking to, people are always like, oh really, like let me tell you about this one thing I saw, or like what do you think they are. Like people are hungry for this subject, but again, like this shroud of illegitimacy keeps like genuine consideration and interrogation of it away.
Right, and that's really sad for people like, the people over in Norway, and scientists that are trying to do good research and that are open with that. And that's been, and Helga, it's nice to see you here from Norway. And I just want to tell you, because you're just buzzing in the show, but this is a photo that I took from when I was over in Norway.
That's
And
so
I'm
cool.
so sad that we didn't get to meet, but I hope to get back over there and visit you and meet you. And thank you for all the wonderful pictures that you send me of Hessdalen. That's such a beautiful place. I love it. But you've got these wonderful projects that have gone on for 30, 35 years, 40 years, and they were incredibly transparent, as scientists should be, with information. And that's been, a thing when you're looking at what's going on in America with specific quote unquote research. It just doesn't even happen. And that's what's not, it's just not the way it needs to go, as you know.
No,
So, okay, I'm glad that you are talking about the data, and thank you for clarifying that, because I've
of
had
course.
definite conversations with people that are just saying all this information is just garbage and that nobody would want it. And I think even Jacques Vallée has gone, on the record many times saying that this is just, it's garbage data, and because of the quality of the investigation, that's what makes it garbage data. And it's like, okay.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like, part of like as any data scientist would say, 80% of their job is cleaning up garbage data. And the first step to discerning whether or not it's garbage is having access to it, not just from one resource, but from multiple resources. Like I said, like I think one of the greatest detriments to legitimizing this field in general is the fact that data and information is siloed across public, private, and government sectors. And I mean, even the high hopes for this NASA investment into like UAP is one of the greatest things that could come out of it isn't going to be finding a UFO or a UAP. It's going to be creating some sort of data standard or aggregation method, so that from this day forward, as we aggregate data or information, it is beholden to particular rigors, or standards to enable, I would say, like top tier or better research. Um, but I mean, people like, man, people love this subject. Like, this is one of those, like, I keep coming back to that. Like, this is one of those subjects. I think people are so hungry for the uncanny and the weird and the mysterious because there's so little space for that in modern society. And this winds up being a subject that people are so fascinated in. And I think that opening data, making it available to people to work on, especially public source or open source, like, that's the way you really get attention and traction. And I think the other thing, or the knock-on benefit of that, is it takes these conversations out of the community, it takes them out of the military industrial complex and out of the private and public sector, and it puts them into the community broadly outside of ufology. And that's where these conversations should be had. I mean, that's where you're going to get fresh ideas and new interesting insights.
Absolutely. And, this weekend there is the GPAN conference going on over in Toulouse, France. And it was interesting. I have a friend, Ted Rowe, who's the executive director of NARCAP, who was over there and presented a couple days ago. And so, you've got Jacques Vallée, I believe, Hal Puthoff, some of these people are over there, but then they're also, I mean, it's a mix of the old guard
Hmm.
and and then some new faces and things, and so that will be interesting to see what happens, and I can't wait to get the report from that. But I just wanted to throw that out there, and I wanted to say, and Steve Long, thank you, and thank you, Rodan, for the nice chat stickers, super stickers. And so thanks for the great conversation tonight. This is from Steve. Lee is an
Thanks, Steve.
example of some of the fresh air and eyes coming into the topic to investigate with objectivity and adherence to established research standards. So, I mean, that's you are, and that's great.
Thank you,
You're right
Steve.
on.
Thank you, Erica.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say hi to Mary just really quickly and Drew. And so let's talk about what you wanted to talk about tonight. And I really appreciate you letting
It
me
wasn't
go.
just UFOs. All right.
I know, but you've got so many interesting things in your background to talk about, and I want to, and I was going to do this, and I didn't, but when I started to paint, which was I was a singer for 25 years, and I got burned out of playing gigs, and so I started to paint, and I actually I had a huge painting that I did, and I did an art show at a Jungian conference down
Cool.
at the public library, and there was a shaman that came in from South Africa, I believe, and very interesting. And he was, speaking in front of this crowd of 1,000 people, and he picked my picture. I'll have to post that later. But I did a picture of this kind of spooky of clouds. Of course, I'm obsessed with clouds, and then this kind of he called it a spooky tree and things. And so that was an interesting thing. There was a time in my life when I was really into, Carl Jung and all of those
Hmm.
things. And I know that you have a similar passion with all of that. But and just on that note, let's just go right into, what you wanted to talk about with ethnographic studies on experiencers.
Oh yeah. So this is my latest kind of pet interest, and I haven't kicked off a project yet. But I like when we're talking about UFO, like our prior conversation aside, like this is like beyond scientific standards and data and stuff. Like I am continually struck by the emergent myth and collaborative myth making that happens in this community. And I say that without value judgment. Human beings tell stories, it's built into us. We love stories and myth, and that's how we share human experience. And I think in the ufology, this happens all the time, through experiencers and through the sort of ancillary constellation of people around experiencers. And I say this to be very candid without conferring judgment or making judgment about the validity of people's experiences. As far as I'm concerned, that is not my, like, I'm like an agnostic about the subject. Like, I think, like, candidly, I think human minds and brains and consciousness do all kinds of weird things under all kinds of circumstances. That's not where my interest lies. Um, but I'm very interested in what seems to me to be a critical need to basically conduct qualitative ethnographic research on experiencers. And what I mean by this is conducting open-ended long-form interviews to document at scale what people experience when they talk about being an experiencer or engaging with a phenomenon. And I particularly bring this up because, one, I went to grad school at Indiana University, who is home to Alfred Kinsey, who wrote the report on human sexuality in the 1950s and conducted thousands of these interviews, and was basically became like the expert and shone light on this subject. And I keep thinking, like, ufology doesn't have an Alfred Kinsey. Like, we tend to think about, like, you know, like, observed phenomena, and maybe we had, like, I guess, like, Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who are absolutely indefensibly bad actors, right? The fact that anyone takes them seriously at this point is an embarrassment. Maybe we had John Mack to some extent, but he was primarily through the psychiatric lens and was also partnered up with those guys. But it seems to me, especially now, given the sort of technologies we have available to aggregate these interviews and to derive insights from these qualitative conversations and identify themes through them, it feels like there's a huge opportunity to do this. Um, and I also say this coming from, I would say, one of the, how do I put this? So while I have only the most perfunctory experience with UFOs, I would say I have a pretty substantial experience with the subjects of, like, religious mysticism and Eastern traditions, subjects like Kundalini, not as someone who has experienced these things, but as someone who is deeply interested in them. And when I started paying close attention to experiencers recounting what they experienced, I kept thinking, oh man, these people are talking about spiritual emergence. They're all having spiritual emergence, but we don't have a narrative to talk about this in Western culture. So instead, we pathologize it, like you think someone's psychotic or manic or whatever, even though this is something that humans have experienced forever across all traditions, all ages, all religions. And, like, how come nobody's taking these stories down and, like, compiling them? Because I feel like you could learn so much just about the experience of, I guess, like, the variability of human experience just through these conversations. You don't have to pathologize them. You're not diagnosing them. You're just hearing their stories and putting them together. And it's amazing to me that this hasn't been done in a serious sense. Like, there's been kind of peripheral efforts, like, guys researching, like, NDEs or OBEs or astral projection or Kundalini experiences. Um, but it feels like no one has directly passed it through the lens of UFOs, and, like, experiencers or contactees. And I feel like there's a huge opportunity to do that.
And I think that would just be so fascinating. And I know, here with Anne Druffel's work, I mean, she spent decades researching abductions, or some of these
Mhm.
encounters and things. And there is really a gold mine here with what she compiled in the interviews that she did. And so I can't wait to get that digitized and then hopefully, share with people like you and things. So this is just it will
Yeah.
be curious and so fascinating. Do you, when you get onto like a social media platform, do you like form a group and then try to get information out of people's experiences on the social media platform, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I have worked very hard to establish myself with the experiencer community, like, very candidly, and to make very clear that, while I may sit sort of on the skeptical side of the aisle, let me put it this way, I'm more skeptical about UFOs than I am about experiences. And I say that because I know these experiences to be documented across so many different cultures and religions. Um, I think the goal would be to have a standardized interview process, right? Like I see a comment in here about having lots of podcasters doing long interviews with experiencers. Yes, that's great. There's tons of these conversations. The point is to aggregate, say, 1,000 interviews that are conducted effectively the same way. They ask the same questions, they dig into the same subjects, and they catalog those interviews into a large corpus, right? So you have, let's say, 1,000 of these interviews. You have the the quantitative data, like the demographics, age, location, sex, whatever, religious disposition, and then you have these qualitative responses. And what you can do then is, either at scale using like natural language processing, so machine learning, or just, going through and using metadata to tag different subjects, you can start extracting thematic elements, right? Do these tend, like, one of these things, like what I think, there's so many opportunities for insight. And what comes to mind is like when people study spiritual emergence, one of the places where something like 15 to 20% of spiritual emergence experiences happen are at airports. And like, who would ever realize that until you started talking to people that were having these experiences, right?
Right.
Because you think of it as happening at like the yoga studio or a breathwork retreat, not at the airport. But I think there's so much continuity of themes from these experiences that could be aggregated and sort of analyzed, and also just from like pure folklore, right? Like being able to tell the stories of these people in a coherent, compelling, and compassionate way, I think is really important. Like I think it's important to give these people a voice because it feels like, rather than pathologizing them or making just like the flying saucers the star of the show, this is still very much a human-centered phenomenon. And making space to, like I said, like gather and aggregate these stories presents a huge opportunity. And like I'm coming at this like as an academic, right? As someone who thinks that it's really important to preserve and document people's experiences and stories, not just for current research, but for posterity, so that in 100 years, when academics or researchers look back at the moment when we're facing existential risk, we're coming out of a pandemic, we're facing like huge amounts of crises at scales at which we've never encountered before as humans. Like, how is this showing up in our collective imaginations? How is this showing up in how we were living our lives? Like, this is critical work. It's critical to understanding ourselves as humans, and it's critical to understanding like what our futures and our values look like. So, I mean, to me, it feels just like a very natural project to pursue, and one that seems kind of critically underserved.
And so where are you, what are your plans? What are you laying out to do to approach this?
What is it? Yeah, what does it look like? So, I think the first step was going to this symposium in New York City last
Yes,
weekend,
I was gonna.
and
Okay,
yeah,
how did
and
that
like
go?
making nice with the other side of the aisle, right? Like making nice with people in the community that are, this is a side of the community I pretty rarely engage with. I don't fight with them, like just different sides of interest. Like it's nothing personal. Um, I think it's, like I said, coalition building, showing up compassionately, hearing people's stories, being patient with it, not conferring judgment on it. But I think the objective is the pipeline would be offering opportunities to do research, or excuse me, to participate in an interview. I guess the first pass would just be a basic survey. Are you interested in being interviewed? What's your demographic information? When are you available? How do we get in touch with you? And then it's setting up a conversation. And the conversation, based on experience, typically goes 45 minutes to an hour. And it's usually, like I said, structured in a very standard way, with the option of the participant always being able to decline to answer a question. Even if they get halfway through an answer and they say, oh, you know what, I don't really want to talk about this, can we move on? You always respect the person being interviewed, right? They're sharing something private and even sacred. What happens then is, ideally I'd love to have a couple of people helping, and I can train them in how to conduct qualitative interviews. But you start basically aggregating these interviews. There's great resources out there. You record them either over Zoom or like audio record, or take really exhaustive notes. You put them into a centralized database. You can have them programmatically transcribed by a lot of these qualitative research tools. So you just upload the video and it'll just write out the text. And then you just start working through and adding metadata. So when somebody talks about like, I was not an experiencer, but then I had a DMT breakthrough experience, and ever since then I keep seeing orbs in the sky and hearing sounds and whatever. then you can tag that with like psychedelic experience or DMT experience. It could be someone who, woke up and saw something in their room, and after that, felt they had precognitive abilities. You can tag that with like a contactee event or precog. And the point is that as you aggregate these interviews, you'll be able to see these continuity of themes. Like you'll see people report similar experiences, similar contexts. And also, I'm not just interested in the sort of similarity or thematic elements. I'm very interested in the personal elements, right? Like, do people deliberately induce these experiences? Why? Like, do they feel like their lives have been enhanced or harmed by them? Like, one of the questions I always like to ask people, and I've had some of these kind of early stage interviews with experiencers I know who've been willing to talk to me so far. I'm always very curious about how people put two and two together. Like, how did you make the connection between what happened to you and like ufology or UFOs in general? Like what was it? Did you see an episode of the X-Files? Did you read a comic book? Did you hear a song? Did you just kind of stumble on the Gaia network and like see a show and it clicked into place? Like, what actually was the connection for you? Because like I said, like when I came into the community and started listening to experiencer stories, I kept thinking, oh, this is spiritual emergence. This is like spiritual awakening or kundalini or whatever, but people are just calling it by different names. But I'm always curious about how people make the association or the jump to something that is paranormal or supernatural. And again, I think it's also just because we don't have good narratives for these experiences in modern culture, modern life. Like even religious traditions like Judaism, Christianity, like experiencing having a mystical experience in a very loose sense, like religious leaders aren't prepared to handle that. Like they don't have a good narrative for how to talk to like a parishioner about this. And I think I think it would just be very interesting to start digging into this.
And I will just say that again, pointing to or talking about what I have here in my archive. I mean, Anne, like I was mentioning, did decades of UFO abduction research, and she was doing that with QFOs, with different organizations that were working kind of behind the scenes and had developed questionnaires, and I'll scan some of those and share those with you because there were specific questions, even when you go to MUFON, you can see questions, and I would be really interested to get your opinion on, when you're looking at some of the questions that are being put forward, what does that tell you about the kind of data that they're collecting?
Mm-hmm. Well, and also, what does it tell you about the preoccupations of the researcher, right? Like one of the things you hear over and over is how much experience or recollections reflect kind of the anxieties of the day, right? Like you hear now so much about the importance of like ecological concerns, and it makes sense because we're living through a climate crisis. So of course that's predominant. In the 90s it was concerns about genetics, which makes sense because genetics and DNA testing were entering sort of the popular imagination. So in a lot of respects, I think so much, and again, like I say this without judgment, like, but I do think a lot of what people experience is very much a reflection of the particular concerns of the moment. So if research, I mean, it would be fascinating to have done research in like 2002 and 2003, because I'm sure you'd hear lots of narratives about war and about September 11th. I mean, you won't hear that now. You'll hear about, Ukraine, and you'll hear about the climate. But having that sort of broader cultural and circumstantial context, and also, like you said, like the questions asked very much betray the interviewer as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the objectives of the interviewer. And I mean, for me, I'm just so fascinated by how people integrate and understand their experiences and sort of contextualize them against their existing belief systems and community connections.
And so, when I look at some of the like, if you go onto the MUFON website and look at the experience here, questionnaire, I mean, it to me, there are important questions, but there are also leading questions. And
Oh
so
yeah.
how do you avoid, when you're doing this, how do you avoid leading somebody, like you're saying, that it's the person that is asking the questions that need, you
Hmm.
need to look at that person as well. But how do you do that from an unbiased point of view?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, like probably the first thing is to, I mean, the first, I think, thing would be to aggregate your question bank and to have it reviewed by an objective third party, someone who is not invested in ufology at all. In fact, probably what I would do is talk to someone who has conducted ethnographic research in like an anthropological or sociological context outside of any of this stuff. Like someone, like my experience with ethnography was I worked on a very large ethnographic project studying the Ashkenazic Jewish communities, so the Jews of Eastern Europe. Um, but to put the question bank in front of someone for review, because when we're talking about a community, like the way you ask about different cultures or traditions or behaviors or beliefs, it's not going to be appreciably different when you're talking to someone who's an abductee or someone who's Romani or Jewish or whatever. The point is you want them to be open about their experience. Um, Also being very mindful about loaded language or language that is either could be misinterpreted or ambiguous or imply a particular viewpoint of the interviewer. So you want to be basically very mindful about neutrality. A really big one, actually, which requires, and I can distinctly remember studying how Kinsey was doing his interviews, is basically training people to be as neutral as possible when they interview. So, and this is everything from being neutrally clothed. So, like nothing provocative, something very neutral, standard, even conservative looking, and being very um, neutral in like any response, no matter what somebody says to you, to be prepared to just say okay and just move on and be ready. I mean, I've done I conducted a huge number of qualitative research interviews on drug use, particularly cannabis and psychedelics, about 18 months ago, and um, I heard all sorts of things from participants in these interviews. And the way you make people comfortable is to take their privacy very seriously, to take what they say seriously, to give them space to talk, and to thank them for their time. You know, like a lot of people want to be helpful and they want to be heard, and respecting their story and respecting their time in the conversation is also really important.
And I absolutely agree with you. But like sometimes with people that have experienced something, or whatever, allegedly experienced something, they're looking for answers to these questions. And so it's like it's so easy to fall in line with somebody who's an abduction researcher, and they're already telling you that this is an extraterrestrial. They're already
Right.
telling you that this is a blonde-haired, benevolent being from the Pleiades, and they're like, trying to save the planet, and you're special, and your DNA is special. It is so easy to
Oh,
get,
it's so seductive,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
right.
And it's seductive because it also confers a desirable status on an experience that may otherwise be very puzzling and even traumatic. But I think the important questions in those situations are to ask things like, how do you understand what happened to you? You know, what do you think happened? Like, how would you describe what I always like to ask people, how would you describe what happened to you? Like, what words would you use? Would you use abductee? Would you use contactee? Would you use experiencer? And I think that that's, I bring that up also because I think there is this huge, um, one of the things I saw last weekend that I had sort of thought happened, but saw very much like firsthand was the like chasm between what I heard at the conference and the interpretive lens that it passed through to get to Twitter, right? And I think too that when we're talking about experiencers, there's an interpretive lens of what people recount in interviews or in a perceived safe space versus what people hear and then transmute into an interpretation. Um, and that that transmutation and that interpretation is also frequently a whole lot of projection, right? Like I read people's responses to the event last weekend, um, on Twitter, and I thought, oh my god, did we even attend the same conference? Like, did we go to the same talks here? Like I never heard the word alien in one conversation when I was there.
Interesting.
Why are people on Twitter talking about aliens? Like, did we not hear the same presentations? Um, and I think that this also definitely happens talking to experiencers. You know, I think going back to how I started this subject, you know, I personally don't come into this with a dog in the fight. You know, like I don't come into this thinking, oh, it's totally extraterrestrials, it's totally, you know, psychosis or it's whatever else. I just come into it from a pure information desire, wanting to hear stories and put them together, perspective. And I think selecting people to participate as interviewers or as data processors, finding people that do not have a teleology or a predestination for their conclusions is critically important.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, another one of the major problems in this, community. I mean, a majority of the people are diehard believers and aren't willing to
Mhm.
look at facts, and be critical with their thinking. And so it would be good to make sure, like you said, that you've got people outside of this field. I think that's
Yep.
key. Absolutely. So, I mean, this is fascinating. Are you working with, is this just a kind of something that is just in the beginning stages? Are you working with anybody to try to get this going on?
Yeah, so it's currently just really in an ideation stage. Like I'm putting out feelers with people that, I mean, the first step was trying to get a sense of, okay, who right now is doing this kind of work, if anyone? How do I get in touch with them? How do I connect with them? I've talked to a few individuals who've conducted a lot of research in like these ancillary fields of near-death experiences, emergence, things like that. Um, the other thing I've been doing is aggregating resources of historic work that has been done in these peripheral subjects, just to get a sense of like what was the approach, how was the methodology, like how sound was the analysis on whatever they gathered. I'm starting to put together a question bank. I've had a few very generous people in my life who are experiencers basically be my proving grounds. I'm like, okay, like I have this question for you. Like, does this sound okay? Like, is this, you know, do you feel judged when I ask it this way? How do you think I should ask it? Because I think, you know, you want to go in with like sensitivity to how, you know, like I said, like terms and words and judgments are communicated. Um, in a general practice, when you're doing these kinds of research projects, you basically start with like clusters of like between like 7 and 10 individuals, and you do them, and then you may like rejigger the interview to some degree. Like it might be that, okay, like people are always consistently talking about, you know, stuff they saw in the sky. Let's try to find more people to talk to about stuff they saw in the sky. So you kind
Mhm.
of like continually readjust your course based on like either themes or subjects that people bring up. And you also make the space to return to people, you know, like you might have someone who has a very compelling narrative. You want to make sure the door is open to go back and have a second or even third conversation with them based on, you know, the intensity and depth and, you know, of their experiences and how much they want to talk about them. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's where I'm sitting right now. Like, I know the methodology, I know how to do this. I'm starting to put out feelers and test cases to start having these conversations. Um, and I think like trying to get together basically like a proof of concept, right? I mean, the good news is I have a lot of time and energy, and I know these platforms. So then it's just getting linked up with the right people to talk to.
Well, I think, there's API case files. They're here tonight, and they just thank you for the donation. But
Mhm.
I really respect that group a lot, and I would recommend maybe getting in touch with them,
Yep.
and so I can introduce you to
Yeah. Oh,
them.
please. Yeah,
Yeah,
I definitely connect with me. I have open DMs on Twitter. I also saw Ray Hernandez was mentioned. I actually just met with him today.
interesting.
So yeah, and him and I had a lengthy conversation about the research that has been done through like sort of the consciousness lens. And yeah, you're right. He has done tremendous amounts of work in this space. Um, But I also think there is an opportunity to bring in some, I would say, fresh blood to this kind of project as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see you connect with API case files because I mean, I really enjoy what they do. I have a lot of respect for what they do, and they're very grounded in their approach, and I like that. So
Mhm.
that would be fun. I would love that. What have you reached out to, people that have a big database like Isaac Coy? Would Isaac Coy be somebody that would be willing to give you information?
Yeah, I hit him up this week actually. And he's doing some research for me, and I expect to hear back from him in the next few days.
Well, that would be good. If I mean, he's got a lot of research, so got a
He's the
lot
man
of
to
data
know.
there.
Yeah, yeah. When I talked to Matthew Riot, he was like, "I don't know, but talk to Isaac," and I was like, "All right, like I have your blessing to reach out." Um, and so yeah, I'm optimistic to get some results there as well.
Oh, that could be interesting. I'm really excited for this, and it'll be fun to see. And I wanted to ask you too, because we hear so much about people that are experiencers, or they feel that they're experiencers, but they've actually been subject to a lot of childhood trauma.
Trauma.
And
Yep.
so, how would you go about dealing with somebody that potentially has a mental illness or is recovering from trauma
Yeah,
when you're doing the study?
that's a really good question, and that's something that I kind of keep revisiting for just from like a ethical perspective, right? Like how do you have these conversations ethically when it could like re-trigger trauma, when it could be, just mental illness. I think part of it is involving someone with those competencies in the creation of any kind of interview process, and also having some kind of like triage process in place for how to prioritize, involve, or dismiss potential candidates. Some of it, you're going to rely on the honesty of the participants, which is always the case, right? Um, and as a result, it's definitely like a self-selecting group to be involved in this kind of project. And you also don't have like the trappings of an IRB to review a project and come back with recommendations. But that is something that I think is critically important to this kind of undertaking, is being mindful to, like I said, mental illness, trauma, or like re-triggering trauma in people who may be recounting difficult events.
And I think that is so important because give going through what I have here and understanding that that was, I mean, there are a lot of people that are subject to early trauma in childhood, and they could potentially be that could their UFO sightings or abduction experiences could potentially just be, kind of a screen for
Screen
their trauma.
memories. Yeah.
And we don't address that enough, and I think the thing that makes me just cringe, and I've mentioned this a lot of times on my show, is going to some of these UFO conferences with people that are engaging and they're hypnotizing people, and they're leading people that could
Hmm.
potentially have mental illness or a trauma that they're dealing with, and they're leading them down the path of you are the one, you are a person who is the chosen one, who's having stigmata, who's that got special DNA, and really furthering any I mean, it's a dangerous thing here
Hmm.
to be doing that. And at what point in time are people going to say, when you're putting on a conference, your responsibility to somebody's mental health is
Hmm.
should be paramount? Because to my
Right.
knowledge, nobody that puts on a conference is taking that into to account.
No, I would agree with that. And I mean, right. And you see this even with like things like regression, hypnotic regression, right? Totally bogus, and also like places participants or patients or whatever in extremely emotionally fragile and vulnerable states, typically with bad actors, like people like you said that are seeking out a particular narrative or story. Um, I think it's but one of the things I will also say too is that I don't think mental illness in and of itself is necessarily a disqualifying characteristic or trait that people
Right.
possess in these spaces. Like, and I say this like just because things like anxiety or ADHD or depression are rife in our culture, and it doesn't, it doesn't sort of dismiss people from having strange or numinous encounters. Um, I do think, I mean, I hate to be legalistic. There's always like some degree of like legal liability that has to be considered, right, when you have these conversations. Um, and I mean, part of it too is just trusting the people you're talking to as much as they trust you, and trusting them to show up as good actors, and to some degree or another, self-assess and make a judgment about whether or not it's in their best interest to have these conversations. I mean, I will say I've certainly talked to a number of experiencers that, I don't know, I would say felt acutely mentally ill, but definitely felt like, there was something else stewing inside them more than an experience. And it's certainly not my place to judge what or if that was. But it also, to some degree, there's an intuitive element, and you can always end an interview or exit a scenario if necessary, if it seems harmful or to be, deleterious to the participant.
And that's, I mean, and that's, I think, something that we need to take into account. And I think also when we're shining a light on some of the corruption and the grifters in the field, look at the practices of the abduction researchers that are front and center on the stage at different conferences. And, like I know when I was involved with the MUFON Experiencer team, for a very brief moment before I figured this was I did not have the capacity, the education, the
Mm-hmm.
background to deal with people like this. And I withdrew, but just to see the way that they were pulling people in and leading them, I just thought it was just absolutely unethical. And at some point in time, you would think there would need to be, I mean, this could be legally, there could be some legal ramifications to this kind of
Oh
abuse.
yeah, for sure, for sure. And that's, like I said, this is all in the very early kind of ideation stage, right? Just getting a sense of who's doing work on this subject, what it would look like to do it in an ethical and sustainable way, and in a way that is ultimately in service to a common and or greater good, right? Like without a sort of like not trying to be a gotcha, not trying to disprove anything, you know. By the way, I'm looking at Amy Collins' comment here. I know too many fields and came out of nowhere. I've had a number of accusations of being intel so far, which I consider something of a rite of passage, because it's only in ufology when I come out and say I don't know very much about UFOs that people assume I'm intelligence. Like
You know what?
incredible.
It's okay. I had heard for, a while that I was working for Bigelow. I mean,
Yes.
I've heard lots of, different things and about me and no,
No,
I've never heard this one
I
before.
have been very much a child of happy circumstance and studying a number of interdisciplinary subjects at a number of different institutions. And as it turns out, developing some of these core skill sets like qualitative interviews, in graduate school and academic research lend themselves very well to my professional work, which is doing basically product management and development. Right? It's amazing how these constellation of skill sets can transfer between, education and professional work. Um, so,
And I think this is so fascinating. You bring so much, uh, in my opinion, that is needed in this with your understanding of many different things, and that's great. I love it. And so, what are some of the? And I wanted to ask you because there were some questions that I forgot to ask, and I really apologize, all of you. This has been
sure.
such an engrossing conversation. But have you ever had an experience yourself?
I wish. No. The closest, and I have talked a little bit about this on other conversations. Like I've had some, I would say, like exotic states of consciousness induced through things like breath work, yoga, like classic Stendhal syndrome, like being overwhelmed at like experiences of natural beauty or art or music. Um, but I do not have or have not had anything that I would characterize as an experience, excepting brushes with like, spiritual like transcendence or whatever, things that I think are, I don't want to say extremely common, but pretty common for anyone who's like a consistent practitioner of, different practices, whether deep states of meditation or breath work or things like that.
And that's interesting. For I have an 600-hour yoga certification, and like I loved, there was a point in my life where I loved doing breath work and meditation and all of these things, and it really does take you into a whole new realm of
Oh,
consciousness, and it's
it
really fascinating.
it totally does. I went to a Groff Institute holotropic breathwork retreat this summer, and it was my first time having like a communal experience like this, and it was amazing. Like extremely healing, incredible, super safe container with incredible facilitators. Um, and it also made very clear to me about how sort of like the process of healing trauma and healing in general is so well served to be done in a community environment rather than as an individual process. It was really cool. If any of your lovely listeners want to check out a breathwork retreat, it's like really, really cool and interesting and very healing.
I loved it too, and I think with Pilates, since I'm a Pilates instructor, I mean, breath work is integral to Pilates.
Hmm.
To
Oh yeah.
just it's fascinating, and it does so much. So I love that, and I want to talk a little bit about um, your fascination with Carl Jung.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Carl
You could
Jung.
throw that out there.
Yeah, yeah. It's so it's funny. So I actually had the good fortune. I worked with a Jungian analyst for a number of years, which like and I always joke about this because I'm like, I don't think it actually helped me fix anything, but I got to know myself really well over those few years. Or I got to understand a whole lot of stuff. Um, yeah, I love Carl Jung. Um how do I put this? And I tweet this line all the time. I appreciate the aesthetics of what he says and his ideas, but I'm not sure I agree with all of them, right? Like, I like this notion of a collective consciousness and myth and archetypes. And I think he provides a number of useful frameworks for understanding and ritualizing huge parts of the human experience, right? And I think that one of the kind of broad subjects I think about frequently is like what we call the meaning crisis in modern life, right? Like when I said there's no narratives to talk about, there's no cultural narratives to talk about experience or phenomena. Like I think Carl Jung's work um, understands the value and importance of symbolism and ritual in human life, even if it is unyoked from conventional materialist truth. And he also understands the value of myth as a function in the human experience to convey timeless truths about the human experience that maybe aren't factually correct, but are true in the sense that they speak to like universal parts of the human condition or of a lived life. Yeah, his Red Book's great. I described his Red Book as psychedelic enough to require integration after reading it. It's pretty far out, completely worth checking out a version of it that's illustrated and colored. It's expensive, but most libraries have it. It's really cool. Didn't publish until after his death. And he talks a lot about the critical importance of like solitude, time in nature, time for reflection, um, and also going inward and being able to entertain these sort of inward journeys and to allow yourself to kind of hear uh, ideas and directions and responses. I have a deep appreciation for the space he creates in his work for kind of the mysteries of human experience. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Interesting. I don't know that name, but I'll make sure to check that out. Sounds very French. Oh, you're muted, Erica.
I made it 1 hour and 33 minutes.
It's okay.
It's a miracle. Okay, so with Carl Jung, I mean, fascinating, and I want to just say I'm very proud to. I Gordon Lohr was an investigator for NICAP, and I was friends with him. He passed away a couple years ago. He was the treasurer for NICAP, and he also has a letter that he gave to me, which is in a letter from Carl Jung to
Cool.
Major Kehoe. And
That's
so,
so
yeah,
cool.
I know I'm very
It's like a saint relic or something. It's
I don't,
very cool.
but, yeah, I mean, it's just, it's so wonderful to definitely have that. And I want to ask too, because, he had an interesting life, and there were, accusations that he was promoting kind of an Aryan agenda with
Oh yeah,
things.
he wrote that essay Wotan about Hitler as sort of in the German collective consciousness. Yeah, I right. It's difficult. I don't prescribe anti-Semitism to him or ascribe anti-Semitism to him, but I do think, look, we're always going to fall into the trap of viewing historical intellectual figures through the lens of modern standards of behavior. And I say this as an inveterate Wagner fanatic, as a Jew, right?
Right,
Like
right. That's the point.
it's like my ultimate problematic fave, right? Like,
Well,
is loving the ring. Um, but I say this too because I think Jung, much like Freud, had very problematic and difficult parts to the work that he produced or that they produced. But I also think that um, they have also contributed enormous works of genius and import. Particularly to like the Western tradition, right? Like I think Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents is one of the greatest works ever in psychology. But talking about a lot of his notions around like sex and hysteria in women is insane and kind of misogynistic, right? You can take the good and the bad together and understand that they're still, as brilliant as these people may be, are still unfortunately prone to the trappings of human failure.
and it is so fascinating, I think, and thank you, API Case Files, again, for the lovely donation. And you're absolutely right. Sometimes people need to back out of cases and get professional help. That's why, one of the reasons why I respect your work so much. So thank you. But I think with Jung, and then, I mean, it is absolutely fascinating that, there was a point in his life where he was thinking that Hitler was channeling Odin, and, these mythical creatures, and gaining these powers. And that whole, in and of itself, that whole history, and Jung, and Hitler, and all of that is fascinating to
Yeah,
me.
it certainly is. My recollection, though, is he never had any particular alignment or support for the Nazis, except, he did write that essay. It's called Wotan, and it's on this subject. But I do also, my recollection seems to be that he was ultimately quite disgusted, understandably so, with the events in World War II, and he, lived beyond them. But I don't think he ever issued any sort of formal retraction of that essay.
Interesting.
So, yeah, for what that's worth.
Well, it's so fascinating. I mean, all of it. And I just, this is where, like, I just geek out on history. And,
Mm-hmm,
I mean,
for sure.
people are brilliant. They're fallible. They change their minds. I mean, it's just, I don't know. He's always been so fascinating to me. And I probably need to reach out to the Jungian Society here in Utah again and go to some of their events, because I always found that very eye-opening. And
Mm-hmm,
so thanks for getting me kind of re-inspired in that regard.
of course. Yeah, I am right. Like and maybe this is a bit of a cop out, but I always find that true creative genius possesses something of a divine spark, right? It's something that gives us kind of a glimpse behind the veil, whether it's art or music, or literature or poetry. And I bring this up because I think that history is littered with truly deplorable people that have made enormous and incredible contributions to the sort of cultural progressions of the world. And I certainly um, think it's important to take a sort of nuanced view of people that, particularly existing in history rather than in 2022, maybe had very bad ideas about things, even if ultimately they had an overall positive or important contribution.
Thank you. That's yeah, it's all fascinating, and it reminds me of, I mean, I just talking about all of this, is there's so many aspects to all of this that I get so focused. For me, I've been very focused on Skinwalker Ranch, on
Mm-hmm.
the corruption of the community, or, the grifting, all of these things. And so sometimes it's really, really nice and important for me, for all of us to kind of step back and then look at some of these other aspects of a subject that should be empowering. And it should, we should want to learn about all of these different things. And it just is, it's very cool. So I appreciate you
Yeah,
talking about these things, and I appreciate your
of course.
dedication to wanting to create an ethical reform with regard to people, to the community, to the subject in general. I think we all absolutely need that.
Yeah, I think so too. Um, Certainly.
And so with your Invisible Night College, so tell me a little bit about when you started that and who's
Sure.
involved and what kind of conversations you are having.
Yeah, so Invisible Night School, where it's Nick Coffin Callis, Campbell Morera, Luis Caetano, and myself. We're on a little bit of a hiatus right now, but we've been doing live streams on YouTube, usually centered around a particular subject or theme. Like we did one on ghosts. That was, here's spooky season, so it was obligatory. We did one on consciousness and like occultism and like particularly Nazi occultism and ufology with Luis Caetano, which was excellent a few weeks ago. We have one coming up on like plasma, UFOs, and the scientific method, which is really like the pet subject of Campbell. The idea is that the idea is to again kind of bring an elevated discourse to the subject. And I say this, like I've said that the legacy of this project, even if it never particularly goes anywhere, is to firstly demonstrate what critical conversation and thought looks like around this subject, right? To put a few people around a table with differing views and opinions and experiences and have them kind of work through like the Socratic dialogue of these conversations and these subjects. The other, more mechanically, is to show people by virtue of example, like how to actually do this kind of research. Like, what does it look like to actually research a case? How do you do it? I'll give a huge prop to Nick because he's really excellent at this. His pet case is the 1994 Lake Michigan sighting, and he has been absolutely exhaustive in his research and could probably like teach a graduate level seminar on like how to conduct research on something because he's so exhaustive, so critical in his approach, and so thoughtful in the kind of multifaceted and multidisciplinary way he has researched the subject. We also periodically do Twitter spaces. The Twitter spaces are pretty well structured. We have the first half just a panel conversation, and then the second half is opened up for community discussion. And those are especially interesting because there's tons and tons of crossover with like the other side of the UFO community. We have experiencers that show up and share their stories. We have people with all different kinds of backgrounds, and they've incredibly not been contentious. They've been like really civilized, open, and collaborative conversations, which I think has been really great and really, like I said, I think coalition building is so important in the community, and it's been giving us a chance to do that.
How fun, and that's wonderful,
Yeah,
and, I mean, and I keep saying Invisible Night College. I don't know why I'm doing that, and I'm sorry, Invisible Night
that's
School.
okay. It's a play on. I mean, it's a play on the Invisible College, right?
I'm telling you, mama's getting old. I don't know, I need to start
That's okay.
cooking
It's
some
late on
local
Friday night.
logo.
It's what 6:45 where you are.
Well,
Um,
clearly, that's obviously
yeah,
way past grandma's bedtime right here, but it's okay. But I mean, that's fun that you've got such a great, diverse group of people, and I like everyone that you have mentioned. So
yeah,
that's
super
really
smart guys,
right.
and I think I think there's also this appetite like one of the things I've said is like we're trying to make a UFO show for people that hate UFOs, right? And like, and what I mean is like trying to make a space to have these conversations without driving towards maybe the kind of communally agreed upon talking points. And I think the real vision here is to eventually expand it outside of ufology, right? Like to bring in just
Right.
kind of any kind of subject that any of us maybe find interesting and think should be discussed. But I would say thematically we really stress like the philosophy of science, epistemology, and ontology, which we hear all the time around UFOs. um, research methodology, and then sort of negotiating these like liminal spaces between lived experience and scientific interrogation.
I've been thinking a little bit about this, and I'm just going to throw this out to everybody. Now that I'm involved with expanding frontiers research, for me, have wanted to try to take the show UFO Classified and kind of incorporate more things like you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about. Because I think, to me, the more I study the UFO topic, the more I feel I need to bring in these other
Yes.
aspects, to educate myself, to educate people, and to offer a broader perspective on things that is much needed. So I'm
Yeah.
excited that you're doing that,
It's
and I'm just throwing that out there to people that this is what
yeah.
I will be doing as well.
Yeah, like one of the suggestions that came through on Cambian's show the other day was like, oh, you guys should really do like a roundtable discussion every couple of weeks, and it could be like Erica and Leah and Cambian, and and like just the idea is to like kind of put like almost like a brain trust together to have these conversations, and like broaden the discourse in general in this side of the community. But yeah, I think the other thing too, and like, I, ufology is inherently interdisciplinary, right? Like it
Right.
literally is like the one subject that touches on every other possible subject. And to take only one particular attack or disciplinary approach feels like it does a total disservice to actually meaningfully exploring it. So, I mean, yeah, like the opportunity to broaden the horizon of your show, I think would be awesome. You should totally take it.
Yeah, I
It
think
would be a great service.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And I've been thinking about this for quite some time, because I love, I love learning about all sorts of things. And it's like this, and that's the way the UFO topic used to be. And I had to, go through some things, but now,
Mhm.
again, I'm kind of finding more inspiration and love of things. And my passion is like, yeah, bringing all of this in,
Yes.
and interviewing people that have information, interviewing historians about the Native American folklore. I've got the University of Utah that's 5 minutes away, and there's so many incredible historians there, learning about geology, learning about specific places on the planet that could be sacred spaces or could have A, B, C, or D. There's so many ways that this topic can enrich your knowledge, that to me, in my opinion, I don't want this to be about a UFO case and an investigation, because to my knowledge, nobody has ever put forward a UFO case that is definitive proof that there's anything going on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like everything, the most interesting stuff in the community is everything except the actual UFOs, right? Like that to me feels like kind of the least interesting part of things. One of the things I've been curious about, Erica, especially given your personal history with the subject and its community, what keeps you coming back and so invested in it?
You know, I I ask myself that question every night, every day.
Yeah, UFO samsara, man. We are
Oh
all
my
trapped in
lord.
it, right?
You know what I mean? Like, and honestly, like sometimes I'll go into my library and just go, curse you, or whatever. I mean, it's why did I get involved in this? I mean, it's not for, a lot of us who get into this, you can potentially alienate friends. You can,
Hmm.
alienate loved ones, or things like that, because it's a strange, topic, a strange field to go down, especially when you go down unfortunate rabbit holes that are conspiratorial minded, and things like that. But I think for me, it's like every day there's another layer to this mystery. And
Hmm.
every day when I go into, walk 5 feet away from here, and I'm picking up a UFO magazine from 47, or I'm looking at a personal correspondence between Kehoe and this person, I'm learning something more about human behavior. I'm learning more about what motivated people to care about the topic, and how different political uh, influences have come into have shaped the topic. And so to me, it's like so layered, and it's fascinating.
Yeah,
And
it's endless. It's like a fractal.
yeah, I mean, it really is. And not to mention the fact that I have people that I love very, very dearly, that have been in my life and mentoring me, and helping me grow the archive and grow as a researcher. And so for me, like one of my biggest passions is making sure that people like Gordon Lohr, like my friend Barry Greenwood, Jen Aldrich, some of these incredible figures in the subject, that their names are never forgotten,
Mm-hmm.
because there is such an attempt right now to grab up all the data and to push it in a box and to rewrite history. And so I feel
Yes.
like it's kind of my my job, and I really feel that I need to preserve history and to make sure that people with motivations that are not in our best interests don't have the opportunity to manipulate that and then take people like Gordon and Barry and Jen and all of these people and erase them from the history of the subject because they've been too important for it
Mm-hmm.
all.
Right. Yeah. Legacy preservation. There's this wonderful museum in Baltimore, Maryland called the American Visionary Art Museum. Candidly speaking, I think it's probably my favorite art museum ever that I've ever been to across Europe, United States, Middle East. And I bring this up because all it contains inside is artwork done by visionary artists. It's art done by people who are not classically trained artists. There are people that taught
Cool.
themselves. There are people who learned folk art. There are people who were possessed by hypergraphia and obsessively drew things their whole lives. And it contains some of the most monumentally beautiful and moving artwork you will ever see anywhere. Um, and I bring this up because this is what ufology feels like to me in the spaces that are really promising, like the work that you're doing, because there's spaces that are not institutionally sanctioned the way other subjects may be, like chemistry or biology or engineering, but they speak to like a true passion and purpose. And I think that that's where really interesting work happens. I think it's where really transformative work happens. And it's also like cutting edge, right? It's the kind of work that in 50 years or 80 years, that's what people will look at as sort of shaping the trajectory of the subject. Like we look at like Jack Parsons was a self-taught aeronautical engineer. He didn't learn how to do this. He taught it all to himself and made his own mark on the aeronautics industry. And I think like the kind of work you do will fundamentally shape the trajectory of the subject in years to come. It's like really, really cool to watch it happen in real time.
Thank you. That means a
Yeah,
lot to me
of
because
course.
it's been an interesting process, and I want to just
I
read.
bet.
um, Oh Lord, but a comment from API Case Files, and he's saying all the best historical figures are deeply flawed, and yes, they are, and that brings. I just wanted to point out in the UFO data collection sphere, people are, they're so interested in UFO cases that they're willing to. That's all. I'm going to take a whole collection in because I want to find that one case, but I'm going to, like what they did at the Roswell Museum, completely destroy a half of a person's work because it's either pornographic or because it's political in nature, and that has nothing to do with UFOs. And that you can't do that. You can't.
Right.
The person, everything that they're thinking and feeling, what they believe, I mean, all of these things are important to really to preserve and to study. That, in my opinion, that's some of the most important
Yeah.
areas that we need to study.
Yeah.
So,
It's it's censorship. Like that's what true
right,
censorship actually
right.
looks like, right? Like the elimination of complexity from a subject in order to fit a prescribed narrative or comfort level.
That's exactly true. UFO censorship, shocking. And
Yes.
when you look at some of the characters involved in the UFO subject, these are probably some of the people that are burning books. And
What do you think motivates bad actors in these communities or in this community particularly?
I think, and that's a great question. I think there's several things. I think some people probably weren't popular in high school and didn't have a sense of community, and so perhaps they're reaching out to the UFO community and trying to be a top dog or trying to be special. I think there are um, people that are narcissistic psychopaths who get involved in this, that are multi-millionaires who like to promote themselves shamelessly and not provide data, that are getting into this to make money off of people's experiences or specific places, and it's all for gain. And then there are um, other people that have been grifting for a long time, and I think when you look behind their lens, they're doing this for political motivations. And I have to specifically kind of call out, you've got Joe Rogan, you've got Bob Lazar, you've got George Knapp, you've got all of the same people, Alex Jones. I mean, you look at some of the people that have been making appearances on Coast to Coast for a
Time
decade.
immemorial. Yeah.
Yeah, and these are people that are now unfortunately shaping a political landscape, not only here but all over the world, which is very alarming and should be alarming to all of us. And so I think there are a lot of different motivations, and to me that's just something that obviously we need to keep shining a light on and calling out, so people that have genuine sightings and have experiences and they want just to educate themselves, they're making sure that they can see that for what it is, and we can move forward in a productive way. But there's, because nobody's ever, in my opinion, done the right thing and held people accountable,
Right.
we've got this complete crap show.
Yes.
So, but today's the day. We will do
Yeah,
that.
we're trying. Yeah, trying to be
Yeah.
good stewards of the community.
We are. And I will, say, and I've mentioned this on my show a few times, but when I got into this, I was very, wide-eyed and just like, okay, I'm at a conference, or I'm speaking to Richard Dolan, or I'm talking to people that have, everybody loves them, and all of these things. And it's like, each of these people, everybody that was anybody is anybody in the field of ufology. I've had off the, I've had candid conversations with, and I've said to each of them, look at what's happening with the way women are treated in the subject. Look at what's happening with racism. Look at what's happening with A, B, C, and D, and how nobody's ever taking the subject seriously. What can we do to change the subject in every single one of them? And I could name names. I mean, they know who you guys know who you are. They all said, well, nothing. It's the way it's always been. And I think, I always just think,
Good vibes only.
yeah, right. Good
Yeah.
vibes only. And it's just like, we know who you are. It's okay. And we're moving on to something better. And I really am happy to know you, and happy to have the people that you have in your life that are supporting the show. And we're all, I hope, creating a cohesive environment where people can feel safe and we can move a productive dialogue forward. I think that's important. And so I thank you for coming on the show and doing what you do. And so I've got to ask you, what are you doing for Halloween?
I mean, honestly, probably not much, but I've been putting together a sexy John Lilly costume because I think it would be hilarious. The inveterate drug weirdo of the 70s who gave LSD to dolphins. He appeared famously in an interview wearing a coonskin cap and a red tracksuit, and I was like, I'm gonna do that and carry a stuffed dolphin, and nobody's gonna get it, but people on the internet will understand, and that's probably good enough for me.
I like it.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I got the chance to dress up for Halloween, so that's what I think I'm going to go with.
Well, I like it. And if I am going to have a little Halloween show, and so if you want to make an appearance, I would love to have you in your costume.
Oh, fantastic. Perfect.
Yep, I think
that would be awesome.
Just throwing that out there. I have no idea what I'm going to be. I'm slacking. I usually have a big party, and I'm just not going to do that this year, but I'll have a party online with all of you guys. So
yeah, with all the turbo nerds that are on our computers.
Exactly. And so where's the best place for people to find you?
I'm most active and visible on Twitter. Okay. Like my handle at Leah Prime. I have open DMs, always open conversation from anyone who's watching or listening. Like, I'd love to talk to people in the community, even if you just want to talk about AI, machine learning, ethical technology, books, opera. That's pretty much covers the subjects I'm into.
And so
I'm always happy to hear from people. Oh, The Ring Cycle. The Ring. D. Valkyrie is my favorite in the entire cycle. I had the good fortune of seeing it at the New York Metropolitan Opera a couple of years ago. First balcony center. It was just me all week. I had 2 nights of Wagner, 1 night of King Lear, and then 2 more nights of Wagner. I was in like bliss.
Oh.
Yeah, shocking that I'm still single, right? But yeah, I had a great time. I dreamed one day of going to Bayreuth in Germany and seeing it in the original theater, but hopefully next year. We'll see.
Well, I was in Germany a couple of years ago and went to some of these places where, say some of these things were created and
Hmm.
it was really absolutely fascinating to me. And my favorite opera is The Magic Flute.
Oh
And
yeah, Die
I think
Zauberflöte by Mozart.
yeah, and for me, when I was in choir in the University of Utah, we sang over in Asia and then we sang in Europe. We toured Europe and so we got to see the Magic Flute at the Vienna Opera House. And so even though I have
Transcendent.
to say I did maybe kind of fall asleep, maybe a little
That's okay.
partway through, but it's just I love Mozart and it was to see it being performed in the place where, it was originally performed, it was just like, wow. This is
It's
so cool.
transcendent.
Yeah, it really
That's
is.
wonderful.
It was really cool. So I appreciate thanks for going off there on Halloween. I hope I'll
Of
have you on the
course.
Halloween show, see you in your costume and thank you for everything. And I want to thank all of you for listening to UFO Classified. Thanks for the chats, the stickers in chat and the support. And also thank you for the people that are donating to the show via UFOclassified.com. Thank you for helping me keep it on the air, helping with the archive and things. Make sure you go to Expanding Frontiers research.org to learn about our wonderful organization. I'm excited. Next week, Jack Brewer will be on the show to talk about something that he's been investigating. We've been doing a little teamwork on. And let me tell you, that just might get some people going. So, Leo, I'll give you the.
Oh, I'll be there. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I have my Friday routine. I go to yoga class and then I watch your show.
Oh,
Usually when I'm like soaking in a hot bath.
thank
So
you.
I'll be there.
Okay, sweet. It's gonna be a good one. I'm sure some people might be
Yeah,
quite excited about it. So
Jack's the man.
I know
So
he's amazing. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening and thanks you guys for everything. Stay safe and
thank you,
hope you
Erica.
guys have a nice weekend. See you guys.